we lived in the Pico neighborhood, and that was before it was grown up to the point where it's there's very little space now for a garden. But anything that my parents didn't grow, then they always went to the Broadway area here in Santa Monica.
Yeah, and I think the same for me. My grandmother always had a garden. I actually have an article about her, and she had a garden on 14th Street in Santa Monica, and she actually got in a little bit of trouble because it was like having a farm in the middle of the city. So she had these giant greens growing and all this stuff, and so I think she was organic and sort of self-sufficient. We also traded with cousins. So it's interesting, I was talking to my cousin, and we were talking about when we would get together and they would have sales at the local market. So they would have 2 pounds of flour, 5 pounds of flour, 2 for 1 or something like that. And you could get this special. And so they would round up all the cousins and line us up. And each kid would get like 2 pounds of flour or 5 pounds of sugar on discount. So we would shop in that way and then sell the product, sell cakes, pies, and that type of thing to increase our income.
I remember my mother, when we were kids, she would drive down on the Santa Monica Pier.
Yes.
And there was a fish market there, and everybody would buy their fish there.
Yeah.
Now you can't drive past, Main Street?
Yeah.
You can't go down on the pier unless you're going in the parking lot. But that was a place where everybody would go and get their fish if the people didn't go out fishing and get it themselves.
Yeah, and they used to dock and come in right by that same fish shop because my grandmother was a deep sea fisher person. Mm-hmm. And so they would go out from there and bring the fish back in, and you could go down there and buy it. And then I was thinking about just the things that we did on the front porch or as a group in the house. Like, what about, did you guys ever make ice cream from scratch? Did the guys ever churn the ice cream churn making ice cream?
No, I missed that tradition as a child, but then later on, going to East Texas with my husband, that was a tradition that they had. It was my mother-in-law, my sister-in-law who lived down the street, and her husband and my husband and me. We would all sit on the front porch there at her house and shell these peas, and it was a tradition. We had the bowl in our laps, and as we were shelling these peas, the time was passed by everybody talking and just having wonderful conversations about, then and now and so forth and so on. And this would usually last for at least an hour and a half, depending on how many people you had to help shell.
We would have them on New Year's. They were symbolic of abundance, nutrition, and they were also shaped similar to a coin. So that was sort of a thing that we embraced as a tradition, to have that as a good luck piece on New Year's Day.
I just talked to my sister a couple of weeks ago, and because it was New Year's, and we were talking about, are you fixing your black-eyed peas? Because it was considered, you have to cook them and you have to have them on New Year's. And so my sister was telling me that a friend of hers who had just recently passed, my sister had this lady's purse in her possession. And as she was going through the possessions in the purse, the lady had some black-eyed peas in a little container, dried black-eyed peas. And so I guess evidently she would take them, keep them on her personal possession for good luck. And then she reminded me that my mother had some in her wallet, which I didn't even know. So all of these little black-eyed pea stories, are starting to come out.
Yeah.
And then by the time that, you'd had black-eyed peas for a couple of days, then somebody, I have no idea, it was either my mother or one of her friends, they came up with the concept of Nigerian tacos. And I said, what is it? Nigerian tacos happened to be black-eyed peas, leftover black-eyed peas, but made into a taco. Take a tortilla shell, fry it just like you do a taco. I said, well, what a creative idea. It's a different way of having it. But then you're bringing in other cultures, you know. So that's what we're having. I put some of those black-eyed peas in the freezer, and I said, well, I'll just bring them out, and we'll have Nigerian tacos one day
Wow.
soon. Yeah.
That reminds me of pinto beans. You know, being here in Santa Monica and having Mexican friends, boy, you can do a bazillion things with chili, with pinto beans. You know, I remember having them like for a week, but it was so much fun because we'd have them, you'd start out with like chili, just straight chili and cornbread or something, and then we would have a tostada. And use the pinto beans as a base and add the cheese and just all these things from that one item.
Mexican Americans would use to make their masa or their tamales. And then my mother would make cornbread, or she would use cornmeal to make a basis for what she called tamale pie.
Oh, yeah.
And it wasn't like tamales, but it was the masa or the cornmeal on the bottom of the pan, and then she would put in the other ingredients, corn and onions, and you know, depending on if she had, most of the time she used tomato sauce, but if she had Las Palmas, Mexican
like enchilada sauce.
Yeah.
Now we have everything is prepared to some degree. So any food that you're going to have, you can get prepared to some degree. Frozen, canned, chopped, pre-chopped mirepoix, which is celery, onions, and carrots, and you can get all this stuff, which I'm realizing when I was looking at Carolyne has taken away from our building of the community. Because when you ask about tradition and holidays, in my house, it was a production. It was all a production. You know, my mom would start making dressing or stuffing, you know, 2 days before Thanksgiving, and that was just the celery, onions, and that being sauteed and making a stock from scratch to use for the dressing, and that people are not really that interested in doing that anymore. So we lose some of our sense of community with all of our shortcuts. I mean, shelling peas. I was so attached to and was charged by seeing bushels of peas at the farmer's market that I bought a whole bushel of peas, and then I got home and I called my sister. I was like, what am I doing? Why do I have, you know, the memory struck me, and there I was like, now I got to shell these peas by myself.
By yourself.
So I think that's part of the community and being seen and being heard and reinforcing our traditions that we've lost for sake of convenience. Because now we just don't have time. The thing that was really fun was sweet potato pies. We used to make them as a family after my mom had been making them for years, and then she had a stroke, and I thought I wanted to motivate her to stay active, and this person did a beautiful job of how to adapt or readapt. And we started a sweet potato pie business, and so every Thanksgiving she would make at minimum 100 pies. And so that was a lot of fun, and it was fun selling them to different groups of people in town, taking them by the Y. When my mom passed away, I stopped baking, and I was like, I don't have to bake anymore. I'm not baking anymore. So I was going into my kitchen right before the holidays, and I wasn't baking. And my kitchen was smelling like there was a pie coming out of the oven. So it was the ancestors giving me a message, and I was very upset about it. I was like, I am so not in the mood for a message about baking when I don't have to bake. And I was thinking, what would the message be? I mean, why would I have to bake? And anyway, there's a family friend, Miss Honda. I told you about Miss Honda. It was to bake for her. It was just to bake some pies for her.
My mother used to make wonderful homemade rolls. And when my mother got married, she had a cookbook. She got a cookbook for a gift. And she did write down the recipe for her rolls in that cookbook. But one ingredient that I haven't been able to figure out, I think I might be able to figure it out, but she put on there grease. You put in there you put grease in it. So I'm thinking, I don't know what kind of grease that would be.
My cousin and I have a way of figuring it out. You can actually reverse construct from the flavor and from the cooking process. We've done that with a couple of recipes that that we have like part of a recipe. My grandmother lived in Santa Monica. I think she passed at like 106. And so my sister was asking her the recipe for this pound cake. And at the end of the recording, my sister's saying to her, "Grandma, are you sure?" And she said, "Girl, listen." Of course I'm sure. And it was a pound of everything.
Oh, right.
Sugar, flour, all of that. But that recipe is interesting because it takes so long to bake. It takes over an hour to bake.
That long?
Because it's so rich. But I think recipes are reconstructable.